Can you imagine swimming in an ocean where the smallest predator is larger than a great white shark? Welcome to Thalassa, a prehistoric sea that would make even the bravest modern diver tremble. Long before whales, modern sharks, or even dinosaurs, there was a world entirely covered in water, dominated by creatures so colossal and strange that they would make any underwater horror movie look like child's play. This ocean was vast, dark, and deadly. Here, Thalassophobia, that deep, irrational fear of the depths of the sea, wasn't just understandable, it was pure logic, because lurking beneath these waters were beasts that redefined the very idea of an apex predator. But Amul, what was this lost world really like? What creatures inhabited it? And most importantly, what made it one of the deadliest environments in the entire history of our planet? More than 250 million years ago, long before dinosaurs walked the Earth, there was a superocean that enveloped almost the entire planet. Thalassa. This gigantic body of water was the only ocean surrounding the supercontinent Pangaea and extended from pole to pole without interruptions. There was no Atlantic, Indian, or Pacific Ocean as we know them today. There was only this vast, unfathomable, primitive global sea. Thalassa was so immense that, in its deepest part, sunlight had not touched the bottom even for millions of years. Its currents were unpredictable, its depths unfathomable, and its waters in some sectors probably lacked oxygen. The supercontinent's coastlines were dotted with active volcanoes and underwater geysers that released heat and minerals, creating nutrient-rich areas ideal for life to flourish. But not a life like today. This was a life alien. In this ocean, the climate was conditioned by an atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide. Temperatures were high and the poles lacked ice caps. The greenhouse effect was constant, creating a marine environment warmer than any modern ecosystem can support. And yet, this hot soup was the ideal setting for the emergence of monstrous life forms. The surface of the sea might seem calm, but beneath it, real wars were being fought between colossal species. The pressure at depth was overwhelming. Temperatures could vary sharply between zones rich in volcanic activity and stagnant areas, and oxygen levels fluctuated extremely. Surviving on Thalassa was not just a challenge, it was an evolutionary feat. Around this ocean, the coasts of Pangaea were rugged, with large cliffs and bare beaches. The mainland was still barren in many places, with few complex life forms, and the first forests of giant ferns, mosses, and primitive plants were only beginning to develop. But the true theater of evolution was underwater. In this context, the creatures that would define an era began to emerge. The ichthyosaurs, the placoderms, the giant nautiloids, and, perhaps most terrifying of all, the dunkleosteus. These predators, equipped with bone armor, jaws of crushing power and lethal speed, turned the Thalassa into a true natural combat arena. But it wasn't just the predators that made this ocean a hell for the weak. There were also the anoxic seas, entire regions where there was not enough oxygen for most living things to survive. Being trapped there meant a slow death from suffocation. And yet, some species found ways to adapt to those conditions, developing alternate respirations or opportunistic lifestyles that allowed them to survive on the edges of disaster. Furthermore, in the deeper, warmer regions of the Thalassa, communities of organisms that did not depend on sunlight to survive thrived. They used the chemosynthesis, a way to obtain energy from chemicals emanating from hydrothermal vents. These extreme ecosystems could have been the first on Earth, and perhaps they could resemble what we would find if we someday explore oceans on moons like Europa or Enceladus. Life on Thalassa was not just survival, it was a constant war for space, food, and oxygen. Every creature that swam in those waters was perfectly adapted to hunt, escape, or die. The balance was so unstable that a simple alteration in temperature or pH could trigger a chain reaction capable of erasing entire ecosystems in a matter of centuries or less. This was the world of Thalassa, a vast, wild, and radically hostile place where evolution manifested itself with teeth, scales, jaws, and armor. And in this world, one of the most fascinating, deadly, and strange faunas the planet has ever seen would emerge. To immerse yourself in the Thalassophobia was to enter a parallel dimension where the biological rules seemed written by a delirious mind. There were no modern dolphins or sharks reigning there, but creatures that seemed straight out of a Darwinian nightmare. And although many of them no longer exist, their fossils tell us stories of a violent, ingenious, and completely alien marine fauna. One of the first titans that prevails in this narrative is the Dunkleosteus, probably the most feared predator of the Devonian, about 360 million years ago. It was more than 10 meters long and was armored with bone armor as strong as steel. The most terrifying thing was not its teeth, because in reality it had none, but its sharp bone plates that functioned as blades. These jaws could close with a force of over 5,000 newtons, capable of splitting in two any creature that stood in its way, even other Dunkleosteus. But this monster was not alone. He shared the throne of terror with the ichthyosaurs, marine reptiles, that dominated the oceans a little later in the Mesozoic. Some, like the Shonisaurus, reached 21 meters in length, which made them comparable to a blue whale. Although many were fast and efficient predators, others evolved into specialized forms, such as the Ophthalmosaurus, which had enormous eyes, adapted to hunting in deep, dark waters. Another of the marine colossi was the Liopleurodon, a pliosaur that, according to some fossils, could have reached 15 meters in length. Although there is controversy over its actual size, the truth is that it had jaws the size of a car and curved teeth designed to crush bone. This predator hunted from ambush, using its strength and speed to pounce on unsuspecting prey, including other large reptiles. Meanwhile, closer to the seabed, the giant nautiloids, predecessors of today's squid and octopus. Some like him Camaraceras. They reached 9 meters in length. Its body was protected by a giant conical shell, and its possibly poisonous tentacles could catch fish, trilobites, or even other mollusks. His slow but relentless way of hunting made him a silent killer, stalking from the darkness of the abyss. Ind, the reefs, veritable labyrinths of sponges, primitive corals, and bryozoans, small but deadly life forms swarmed. Armored fish, aquatic amphibians, and giant arthropods, such as the Gecalopterus, a species of sea scorpion that could reach 2.5 meters in length. Although it technically lived in more coastal waters, its presence turned the banks of Thalassophobia into deadly hunting grounds. There were also the strangers conodonts, eel-like creatures with jaws filled with spine-like dental elements. For a long time, scientists did not know which group they belonged to, but their remains are so abundant that they are used today as key fossil markers for dating geological layers. Although they were not large, these microscopic hunters helped keep the ecosystem in balance, just as small fish or squid do today. The most fascinating thing about these inhabitants was how they represented a whole range of evolutionary strategies. Some relied on speed, like ichthyosaurs, others in the armor, such as placoderms. Some, like pliosaurs, used stealth, and nautiloids used their internal structure to control their buoyancy and move between different levels of the ocean with surgical precision. But if there was one thing they all had in common, it was the constant need to adapt. Because in Thalassophobia, if you didn't evolve, you died. And this arms race between predators and prey gave rise to creatures so specialized that their mere existence seems like a cruel evolutionary joke. The curious thing is that, despite how brutal these species seem, many of them share deep connections with modern animals. The squid, octopus, shark, or even the bony fish that we see today have ancestors that lived in these waters. The ocean we know today is just a calm shadow of what was once the liquid hell of the Thalassophobia. In the Thalassophobia, survival was not a matter of luck. It was an endless game of chess where each piece, each creature, had to develop its own strategy to stay alive another day. In an environment where being big did not guarantee dominance, the key was adaptation, and their evolution gave no respite. It rewarded the clever, the best equipped, and mercilessly eliminated those who did not adapt. Let's take the Dunkleosteus, for example. His strategy was simple and effective. Brute force. With one of the most powerful bites ever recorded in the animal kingdom, its mouth was a veritable steel trap. But in addition to his jaw, he had another advantage: his bone armor. It was covered by front and side plates so thick that few could stand up to it. This armor not only protected it from predators, but also from its peers. It is known that Dunkleosteus probably fought among themselves for territory or mates, and their bones show bite marks from other members of their species. However, not everyone could resort to force. Others, like the nautiloids, they relied on stealth, flotation, and camouflage. Their shell allowed them to control their position in the water, rising or falling like living submarines. Its tentacles, apparently sensitive and possibly poisonous, caught prey at the slightest carelessness. In addition, they could withdraw into their shell to protect themselves from attacks, a defensive technique that allowed them to survive millions of years beyond their contemporary predators. Later, the ichthyosaurs. They would become the kings of speed. Their hydrodynamic bodies, similar to modern dolphins, allowed them to travel long distances at high speed. Their eyes, enormous and adapted to vision in deep water, gave them an advantage in detecting prey before they were seen. Some had specialized teeth for catching slippery fish, others developed pack ambush techniques. Indeed, it is believed that certain ichthyosaurs hunted in groups, a social strategy that was surprisingly advanced for its time. In darker areas, other creatures developed even stranger adaptations. Some bioluminescent species produced their own light through chemical reactions, attracting prey or confusing predators. These mechanisms are similar to those we see today in modern deep-sea fish, such as the lanternfish or the famous angler fish. Imagine swimming in complete darkness and seeing a small point of light moving gently, only to discover that it's a lure in a monster's mouth. But the prisoners also had their own thing. Many bony fish developed venomous spines, reflective scales, or even the ability to inflate like current pufferfish do. Some evolved flat bodies to hide under the sand of the seabed, while others imitated textures or colors of the environment to blend into the background. These forms of camouflage were not a luxury. They were a requirement for survival. There were even chemical strategies of survival. Certain algae and sponges produced toxins to avoid being devoured, directly affecting the food chain. These compounds, in many cases, are still present in current species and are being studied today as possible medicines. One of the most interesting tactics was the cannibalism. When resources were scarce or competition was fierce, many species did not hesitate to devour their young or their peers. Dunkleosteus once again appears as an example. Fossil remains show signs of having been bitten by other individuals of its species. This brutal practice guaranteed that only the strongest survived, further reinforcing natural selection in these prehistoric oceans. Finally, there was the size strategy. Some creatures, such as Plesiosaurios, they simply grew so large that they had no natural enemies. Their dimensions allowed them to dominate vast regions of the ocean, and their energy was focused on maintaining that size, searching for large prey, and reproducing. But growing so much also had its price. They needed large amounts of food, which made them vulnerable if the ecosystem changed. Panthalassa was like an eternal chess, but with the pieces changing shape each generation. A predator's weapon today could become useless tomorrow if its prey evolved a new defense. The evolutionary race was constant, and there was no final victory, only temporary survival. And in that perpetual struggle, the most bizarre, deadly, and fascinating creatures in the history of life on Earth were forged. But the question was, could these strategies save them when the planet itself decided to change the rules of the game? The Panthalassa was a brutal and magnificent ocean, but even the most extreme environments have their Achilles heel. And for this blue colossus, its greatest threat came not from without, but from within. As the millennia passed, something began to change. Very slowly, like an invisible crack forming in the hull of a ship, conditions on Panthalassa began to become unstable. It all started with a series of silent but devastating geological events. Deep within the Earth, magma moved with increasing violence. The tectonic plates beneath Pangaea and Panthalassa began to crack, creating fractures that triggered one of the largest volcanic eruptions of all time, the formation of the Traps Siberianos. These gigantic lava flows, spanning millions of square kilometers, released colossal amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The result was a brutal climate change, a true planetary fever. Global temperature increased dramatically. The already warm oceans became even warmer, and with the heat came the consequences. The oxygen levels in the water began to drop alarmingly. This phenomenon, known as oceanic anoxia, turned vast regions of the Thalassophobia into dead zones. Without oxygen, many organisms simply could not breathe. Large animals with demanding metabolisms were the first to fall. Creatures that once dominated the seas with strength, size, or intelligence now floated limply or desperately fled these deadly zones. But volcanic gases not only heated, they also poisoned. Sulfur dioxide released by the eruptions combined with water vapor to form acid rain, which fell on land and sea, disturbing the chemical balance of the oceans. The pH of the water dropped, especially affecting organisms with calcium carbonate shells, such as corals, mollusks, and some plankton, whose structures were literally beginning to dissolve. The imbalance was amplified in chain. With less oxygen and more acidity, the ecosystems collapsed from the bottom up. Phytoplankton, the main food source for many species, decreased. Without plankton, food chains collapsed like dominoes. Smaller species died or migrated, leaving large predators without prey, which in turn began to starve or fight each other for the last available resources. In parallel, there were variations in sea levels caused by the thermal expansion of water and the collapse of some coastal systems. Coasts changed shape, habitats shifted or disappeared completely, forcing thousands of species to adapt or become extinct. Entire reefs were buried, deltas swept away, continental shelves submerged. What was once an ecological paradise has been transformed into a death trap. The seas became denser, darker, more treacherous. The ancient giants could no longer roam freely like before. Many died trapped in regions where oxygen was gradually disappearing. Others migrated to colder, deeper areas, but there they encountered new dangers. Extreme pressure, food shortages, and fierce competition. Even the sky began to darken. Ash from the eruptions covered the atmosphere, blocking sunlight for years. This further reduced photosynthesis in the oceans and briefly cooled some coastal regions. An ironic swing of heat and cold, of excess and lack, ended up breaking the ecological balance of the Thalassophobia. And in the midst of all this chaos, a new villain emerged, the hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas that may have been released from the seafloor during anoxia events. This gas, lethal to almost all life, accumulated in the atmosphere in concentrations that could have poisoned not only the inhabitants of the ocean, but also many land animals. This apocalyptic scenario coincided with the end of the Permian, approximately 252 million years ago. That's when what scientists call the Great Dying, the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history. It is estimated that until 96% of marine species they disappeared, a chilling, unthinkable figure that forever reconfigured the evolutionary history of the planet. The Thalassophobia was not destroyed by a single cataclysm. He was slowly suffocated by his own collapsing system. Its greatness was its condemnation. The more vast it was, the more difficult it was to adapt. The more diverse, the more fragile the balance became. The titans fell, the colossi were silenced, and of the ancestral roar of that infinite ocean, only the fossilized echo of what once was remained. The fall of Thalassophobia was slow but relentless. For millions of years, this ocean was home to creatures that defied logic and the limits of biology. However, neither the sharpest jaw, nor the thickest armor, nor the most elaborate strategy were enough in the face of what was coming, one of the greatest natural catastrophes in the history of the Earth. What we know as the Permian-Triassic extinction, or simply the Great Dying, it was not a sudden event like the impact that would wipe out the dinosaurs millions of years later. It was a prolonged collapse, an agonizing symphony where each instrument, each species became silent one by one until the sea was silent. The first to disappear were the organisms more sensitive to oxygen: corals, brachiopods, trilobites. The most primitive forms of life, those that formed the basis of the marine ecosystem, collapsed in a domino effect. Reefs that had taken millions of years to form were dismantled in just a few millennia. And as always happens in nature, the fall of some dragged others down. Large predators such as Dunkleosteus, they were condemned not for their weaknesses, but for the disappearance of their prey. Some tried to adapt, hunting smaller species or migrating to new areas, but it was too late. Their size, once a symbol of power, became a curse. They required too much energy to survive in a world that could no longer feed their voracity. The primitive ichthyosaurs, although faster and more versatile, also suffered devastating losses. The ecosystems where they used to thrive, warm seas rich in plankton and fish, had disappeared. Some lineages managed to resist and give rise to new forms in the Mesozoic, but the oldest, those born in the Panthalassa, were trapped in a downward spiral. And it wasn't just animal species that disappeared. The entire ecological landscape changed. Ocean currents, altered by the increase in temperature and lack of salinity, stopped distributing nutrients efficiently. The ocean became a liquid desert where even photosynthesis was insufficient to sustain life. Areas once filled with creatures became barren, empty, ghosts of what they once were. One of the final nails in Panthalassa's coffin was the possible proliferation of anaerobic bacteria, which not only survived without oxygen, but produced hydrogen sulfide, H2S, as waste. This highly toxic gas could have emerged to the ocean surface in massive quantities, rising into the atmosphere. Not only did it poison the sea, it could also have affected life on Earth, destroying the ozone layer and leaving the planet vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation. All this happened within a period of about 60,000 years. In geological terms, that's less than the blink of an eye. It was a methodical and total extermination. Close to 96% of marine species. They disappeared. And we're not just talking about individuals. We're talking about families, orders, entire lineages erased forever. The end of the Permian was literally the biggest ecological reset in the history of the planet. The Panthalassa creatures left no heirs. Many of its forms, its strategies, its evolutionary designs became extinct without ever returning. Where armored fish once dominated, new creatures with lighter skeletons emerged. Where steely predators hunted, more streamlined reptiles now swam, such as the ichthyosaurs of the Triassic. The ocean did not die, but it did reborn. Panthalassa, although it continued to exist as a body of water, was no longer the same. The post-extinction ecosystem was different, less diverse, simpler, and in many ways, quieter. Throughout history, life has demonstrated amazing resilience. But this event marked a before and after. He showed us that not even the titans are eternal, that change can be so violent that no survival strategy is sufficient. The Panthalassa, that immense, deep and terrifying ocean, ended up defeated not by a greater monster, but by the internal imbalance of its own world, by gases, by heat, by chemistry, for changes as invisible as they are lethal. And in its waters, not only billions of corpses were buried, but also a lesson that the Earth has not yet forgotten. The Panthalassa was more than an ocean. It was a realm of wonders and horrors, of impossible shapes and unstoppable forces. Today, its depths are lost in the folds of time, but its warnings live on. We live on a planet where climate change, ocean, acidification and massive species loss remind us eerily of that ancient end. Are we repeating the steps towards a new great dying? The story of Panthalassa is not just a tale of extinction, but a warning written in stone and fossil. A lesson that screams from the depths, life is resilient, yes, but not invincible. Will we be able to hear that echo before the sea falls silent again?